on Sunday, September 29, 1872. Ruth Quenby knew something was wrong with Larkmead Home Farm before anyone invited her to have an opinion. The evidence stood in the Michaelmas cattle pens beneath strings of prize ribbons and polite praise. A red steer carried less flesh over the ribs than Ruth expected from an animal supposedly finished on premium winter feed. A brindled cow beside it showed the same quiet contradiction. Neither beast was neglected, neither was badly kept. That was precisely what troubled her. Someone was spending heavily to produce middling results. Beyond the pens, tenants and neighboring, landowners gathered for the post-service agricultural luncheon, discussing the ploughing competition held the previous day and examining the livestock displayed for prizes. Silver cups gleamed on a long table beneath the awning. Estate stewards moved between visitors with papers and catalogues. Larkmead Park looked exactly as a great Hampshire estate ought to look on Michaelmas. Orderly, prosperous, certain of itself. Ruth stood half a pace behind the Dowager Duchess of Rivenhall, where a paid companion belonged, and tried not to stare at the account sheet propped beside the cattle display. The sheet was meant to advertise efficient management. Instead, it sharpened her concern. The recorded expenditure on purchased feed was too high for what stood in front of her. Ruth had spent enough years helping her late maternal uncle on his mixed farm to know that cattle could disappoint for many reasons. Poor drainage, wasteful rationing, weak hay, bad timing, a cold season, an indifferent beast. But when several ordinary causes were possible, respectable accounting did not eliminate them. It gave them somewhere to hide. Her fingers closed around the edge of her reticule. Inside lay the worn beechwood seed scoop that had belonged to her uncle, carried more from habit than sentiment. Its smooth handle pressed faintly against the fabric. "You are staring, Miss Quenby." Lady Mildred Stonor's voice arrived with the pleasant sharpness of a pin hidden in silk. Ruth turned. Lady Mildred stood beside two visiting ladies, elegant in deep green, her expression composed enough that cruelty could pass for conversation. "Forgive me," Ruth said. "I was looking at the cattle." "So I gathered. One might almost think you intended to inspect them." One of the ladies smiled into her glove. Ruth had learned long ago that a woman in her position survived many rooms by declining invitations to defend her own intelligence. She could have stepped back. Instead, her gaze returned to the red steer. "They are worth inspecting, are they?" Mildred followed her glance. "Mr. Goulding has just explained that Home Farm has had an expensive year. I imagine that settles the matter. An expensive year is not always the same thing as an expensive necessity." Mildred's brows rose. How fortunate for His Grace that his mother's companion has become an agricultural economist. A masculine voice behind Ruth said, "I was about to say the same thing, though perhaps with less elegance." Ruth turned and found Marcus Holcroft, Duke of Rivenhall, close enough to have heard every word. At 39, he wore authority lightly because he had never needed to prove he possessed it. His expression held amusement, but his attention was sharper than his smile. Ruth curtsied. "Your Grace, Miss Quenby." He glanced at the cattle, then at the account sheet. "Should I be alarmed?" Mildred answered before Ruth could. "Not unless your paid companions have begun conducting estate audits." Marcus looked back at Ruth. "Have they?" "No, Your Grace. Pity. It would save on clerks." Mildred laughed. Ruth did not. Marcus noticed. "You disagree with the display?" he asked. The safest answer was obvious. Ruth felt it waiting for her. She also saw the red steer shift its weight against the rail, revealing again the disappointing line over its flank. I disagree with the confidence of the conclusion. Marcus's amusement changed. Which conclusion? Before she could answer, Mr. Isaac Goulding approached from the far side of the pens. He was a broad, carefully dressed man of 48, who had served Larkmead long enough to move among tenants with the assurance of permanent furniture. "Your Grace," he said, "I hope Miss Quenby has not been troubled by the figures. They are summaries only. She appears troubled by the cattle." Marcus turned to Ruth. "Tell me why." Mildred's smile widened. More people were listening now. Ruth could feel it without looking. Tenant farmers nearest the pens had gone quiet. She had become an entertainment. That knowledge should have silenced her. Instead, it steadied her. "The feed expenditure is high," she said. "The animals before us do not appear to show the return I would expect from the amount recorded." Goulding gave a patient smile. "Cattle are not ledgers, Miss Quenby." "No, that is why I am looking at both." The smile vanished from one corner of his mouth. Marcus folded his arms. "What would you look at next?" Ruth hesitated only long enough to be exact. Actual grade of purchased feed, how it is rationed, waste, root stores, drainage, milk yield, which animals receive what, whether the price includes carriage or intermediary charges, whether Home Farm is paying for quality it actually receives. Goulding said, "You are describing half a year of farm management as though it were a parlor exercise. I am describing questions. Questions asked without responsibility for the answers." Ruth met his gaze. "That can be remedied." The words escaped before caution could reclaim them. A tenant near the rail coughed to disguise a laugh. Marcus's eyes brightened. Can it? Ruth knew then that she had crossed the line between observation and consequence. "If your Grace wants a fair test," Mildred gave a soft laugh. "A fair test of what?" Marcus looked from Ruth to Home Farm, visible beyond the lower meadow. Then he said, loudly enough for the listening tenants to hear, "Let her play at farming." Laughter moved through part of the gathering. Ruth felt heat rise beneath her collar. Marcus continued, still half amused. "Home Farm until Lady Day. If Miss Quenby believes the difficulty can be found in the management, rather than merely blamed upon the season, she may prove it," Mildred murmured. "How diverting." Ruth looked directly at Marcus. "No." The laughter stopped. Marcus's eyebrows lifted. "No? Not if your Grace means responsibility without authority." Something in his expression changed again. "Explain." "If I am to be blamed for the farm, I must be able to manage it. Labor allocation, ordinary purchases within the existing budget, stock management, access to the books. If every instruction requires Mr. Goulding's approval, then the result will prove nothing except which of us already held power." Goulding's face hardened. "Your Grace, this is hardly." Marcus raised one hand. Goulding stopped. Marcus studied Ruth for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "Exceptional expenditure comes to me." "Of course, you do not alter tenant rents." "I would not presume to." "You do not dismiss permanent estate staff without consultation." "Agreed. Everything else within Home Farm and the existing budget?" Ruth held his gaze. "If the authority is real, then it is real." No laughter followed this time. Marcus turned to Goulding. "Have the Home Farm books sent to Miss Quenby this afternoon? Mr. Pritchard is to be informed that she manages the farm until Lady Day." Goulding's jaw tightened. "As your Grace wishes." A clerk brought the brown leather Home Farm account book from the display table. Marcus took it and offered it to Ruth. She reached at the same moment. Their gloved fingers touched over the worn leather spine. The contact lasted no more than a second. it was still long enough for Ruth to notice the warmth through 2 layers of kid leather, and long enough for Marcus's gaze to drop to their hands before returning to her face. Neither commented. Ruth took the book. It felt heavier than its size warranted. Responsibility often did. Marcus's expression softened into something no longer quite teasing. Lady Day, Miss Quenby. Lady Day, Your Grace. He moved away to greet another tenant, leaving the crowd to resume its conversation around them. Ruth drew one slow breath. She had wanted people to stop dismissing a question. Instead, she had acquired a farm. Goulding remained beside the rail. His voice was low enough that only Ruth heard. A farm is less forgiving than a luncheon table, Miss Quenby. Ruth tucked the account book beneath her arm. That is one of the reasons I prefer farms. She walked toward the Dowager Duchess without looking back. Behind her, the Michaelmas gathering returned to prizes and polite speeches. Ahead lay 6 months of mud, winter feed, ledgers, cattle, and a promise made publicly enough that failure would belong to her alone. What Ruth did not yet know was that somewhere inside Larkmead's orderly accounts, the difference between what the farm paid and what the farm received had already begun to leave a trail. By the 3rd morning of October, Ruth had learned that Home Farm did not suffer from one obvious failure. It suffered from habit. Habit had left the western drainage half blocked because the lower field had always held water. Habit sent the same measure of feed to animals of different size and condition because Pritchard's predecessor had done it that way. Habit allowed root stores to be estimated by eye, dairy yields to be discussed from memory, and every purchasing question to end with the same answer. Mr. Goulding arranged it. Ruth stood in the cattle yard shortly after sunrise with the brown leather Home Farm account book tucked beneath one arm, while Pritchard, the foreman, explained for the 2nd time why several instructions had not yet been carried out. He was a capable man in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, careful with animals, and plainly uncomfortable with the novelty of taking orders from a paid companion. Ruth did not blame him for discomfort. She did blame him for delay. "You asked me to mark the cattle by condition," he said, rubbing one thumb along the edge of his cap. "But Mr. Goulding says the ordinary arrangements ought to continue until His Grace decides how far this experiment goes." Ruth looked at him. "His Grace decided on Sunday." "Yes, miss. In front of you." Pritchard hesitated. "I was near enough." "Then we should not ask the Duke to repeat himself every time a cow requires weighing." The corner of Pritchard's mouth moved before he suppressed it. Ruth opened the account book. "Today we do 3 things. Clear the worst section of the western ditch. Measure the root store instead of estimating it. Separate the feed issue by stock class and record what actually leaves the store. That will slow the men. For 3 days, perhaps. Waste has been slowing the farm for longer." Pritchard glanced toward the stable yard as hoofbeats sounded beyond the gate. Marcus rode in without an escort, dismounted, and handed his reins to a stable boy. His boots were polished. Ruth noticed this because Home Farm mud had already defeated everyone else's. "Good morning," he said. "Have I arrived before the revolution?" "Only before breakfast for some of the cattle," Ruth replied. Marcus looked from her to Pritchard. "Trouble?" Pritchard's discomfort deepened. Ruth could have let him answer. Instead she said, "Confusion, Mr. Goulding has told the men ordinary arrangements should continue." Marcus's expression changed very little. Did he? He may have meant only that estate procedure should not be disrupted. Ruth did not soften the fact, but the result is that Mr. Pritchard is waiting for Mr. Goulding to confirm instructions already within my authority. Marcus turned to the foreman. You needn't do that. Pritchard removed his cap entirely. Your Grace, Miss Quenby has home farm until Lady Day. If she orders work within the authority I gave her, you do not wait for Mr. Goulding to repeat it. If she asks you to purchase a new steam engine or drain Hampshire into the Channel, come and find me. Ruth looked at him. I had no plans for Hampshire. Excellent. One anxiety removed. Pritchard gave a reluctant cough that might have been amusement. Marcus continued, if an instruction exceeds Miss Quenby's authority, tell her directly. Do not create a second chain of command because the first one feels unfamiliar. Yes, Your Grace. The foreman left to organize the ditch work. Ruth closed the account book. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. You have apparently condemned me to inspect a ditch. I had not realized dukes required protection from drainage. We are a delicate breed. He followed her across the yard toward the lower field. Ruth tried not to smile. The attempt failed when Marcus stepped around one muddy rut, avoided it neatly, and placed his next boot directly into another. Mud climbed over the polished leather to his ankle. He stopped and stared down. Ruth made a sound before she could prevent it. Marcus looked up. Was that laughter, Miss Quenby? No, Your Grace. It had remarkable similarities. I was startled. By what? The speed with which agriculture has improved your boots. He looked at the ruined polish and laughed, not the controlled laugh he used among guests. This one came quickly and without permission. Ruth laughed with him. For a few seconds, the difference between a duke and a paid companion became less important than the absurdity of mud. Then Marcus glanced at her, and the laughter softened into a quiet, shared awareness neither of them named. Ruth turned toward the field first. The ditch is this way. By noon, the western work had begun. The root cellar was being measured, and Ruth had accumulated enough numbers to know that Home Farm's difficulties would not be solved by one clever adjustment that reassured her more than a dramatic discovery would have done. Real farms rarely offered dramatic discoveries. They offered small losses repeated, until no one remembered they were losses. She entered the feed room after luncheon with Pritchard and began comparing the stockbook with what actually stood on the wooden platforms. Barley meal, bran, linseed cake, mixed winter feed. Several sacks bore familiar merchant marks. Ruth ran one gloved finger down the list while Pritchard called quantities. 3 there, he said. 2 opened, 1 behind. Bring the unopened one forward, please. He shifted the first sacks. The last one emerged into the light. Ruth stopped. A red mill stamp crossed the coarse fabric near the upper seam. Beneath it was a grade marking she recognized from years of helping her uncle purchase winter feed. 2nd grade. She looked at the open account book. The corresponding entry recorded premium mixed feed at the higher price. Mr. Pritchard. Miss, has this sack been opened? No. Moved recently? Not that I know. Ruth crouched without touching the cord. The stamp was not faint or damaged. Do not open it. Pritchard frowned. Is something wrong? Possibly. Possibly not. She stood. For now, no one opens this sack, moves it unnecessarily, or throws away any empty sack from the same delivery. Pritchard looked at the account. That says premium. Yes. And this isn't? The marking says 2nd grade. Could the sack have been reused? That is one possibility. A voice behind them said, or the warehouse sent the wrong bag. Isaac Goulding stood in the doorway. Ruth had not heard him enter. His gaze moved from her to the red stamp. It happens, he said. A laborer picks up the wrong sack. No great mystery. It may be exactly that. Goulding stepped forward. Then we needn't make theatre of it. He reached toward the cord. Ruth moved between his hand and the sack. She did not touch him. She did not raise her voice. Please don't open it. Goulding stopped. Miss Quenby's. If we are to discover whether the contents match the marking, the sack must eventually be opened. Eventually. And why not now? Because at present it is one unopened sack with a grade mark that does not match the account entry. Once we open it casually, we lose the chance to establish what condition it was in before anyone inspected the contents. His eyes narrowed. You think someone has tampered with the estate feed? I said nothing of the kind. Marcus appeared at the threshold behind Goulding, his muddy boots now dried to a dull brown. What did you say? Ruth turned. That the account records premium feed. This unopened sack is marked second grade. Mr. Goulding believes it may be a warehouse mistake. He may be right. Marcus looked at the sack. And you want it left alone, until we know how to examine it properly. Goulding folded his arms. One sack proves nothing. I agree, Ruth said. One sack proves almost nothing. Marcus studied her for a moment. Then leave it where it is. Goulding's jaw tightened. Your Grace. If it is a warehouse error, it will still be a warehouse error tomorrow. Marcus looked toward Pritchard. No one opens it. Yes, Your Grace. By late afternoon, Ruth had almost convinced herself the matter might remain small. Then a boy of perhaps 14 arrived from Mr. Kemp's tenancy, carrying a folded, empty feed sack over one shoulder. Mr. Kemp said, Miss Quenby wanted to see old markings if we had them. Ruth took the sack from him and spread it carefully across the feed-room table. The fabric was worn and already used. It could never carry the same evidentiary weight as the unopened home farm sack. But across one corner, faded by handling, was the same red mill stamp. The same second-grade mark sat beneath it. Pritchard swore softly under his breath. Ruth said nothing. She looked from the used Kemp sack to the unopened sack, still resting where she had ordered it left. Then to the home farm account book recording premium feed. One wrong sack could still be a warehouse mistake. 2 sacks delivered to different holdings were the beginning of a pattern. By the following Monday, Ruth had stopped thinking of the red stamp as an interesting inconsistency and begun treating it as a question that could damage men if answered carelessly. The unopened home farm sack still rested where she had ordered it, left in the feed room. The used sack from Mr. Kemp's holding lay folded on the work table beside it, its faded red mark visible against the worn cloth. Ruth had touched neither since the previous afternoon. She had spent the intervening days comparing entries, delivery dates, and quantities, without telling herself a story before the records earned one. That restraint did not make the question smaller. It made it more dangerous. Marcus arrived shortly before 10 with Mr. Hales, the estate clerk, and Isaac Goulding behind them. Hales carried a narrow daybook and the estate office seal. Goulding carried nothing, but his expression suggested he considered the entire exercise excessive. Ruth stood beside the table with the brown leather home farm account book open before her. The used sack came from Mr. Kemp's holding, she said. It has already been emptied, so it cannot tell us what the original contents were. The home farm sack is different. It is unopened and still bears the same second-grade mark. Goulding glanced at the folded Kemp sack. A merchant ruses cloth. A carrier misplaces goods. A warehouse boy ties the wrong label to the wrong order. None of this is remarkable. I agree, Ruth said. Goulding looked almost disappointed. Marcus noticed. Then why are we here? He asked. Ruth turned the home farm ledger toward him. Because the account records premium mixed feed at a premium charge, the sack is marked second grade. That may still have an innocent explanation, but if we open it casually and later discover a larger discrepancy, we will have destroyed the best chance of knowing what condition it was in before anyone examined it. Hales nodded. That is sensible. Goulding gave him a cold look. We are discussing cattle feed, Mr. Hales, not crown jewels. Hales lowered his eyes to the daybook. Ruth said, its value depends on the question, not the cloth. Marcus looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, but there was no laughter in it. What do you propose? Record what we have. Preserve the unopened sack. Then ask someone independent in Winchester to identify the mill mark. Goulding folded his arms. And after that? After that, if the mark means what I think it means, we compare the supplier's description with the estate account. If it does not, we stop. You think it means second grade? Yes. So you have already decided? No. Ruth held his gaze. I have recognized a mark. Recognition is not the same thing as proving what was ordered, delivered, or charged. For the first time that morning, Goulding's expression lost its patience entirely. Marcus stepped closer to the unopened sack, but did not touch it. And the Kemp sack? Supporting pattern only. Nothing more. Good. He looked at Hales. Record the unopened sack as found. Note the existing cord and mark. Secure it. Hales moved forward. The work itself took less time than Ruth had feared. He wrote the date, location, visible grade mark, condition of the cord, and the names of those present. He did not untie anything. He added a second cord around the neck of the sack, fixed the estate seal in wax, then showed the impression to Marcus and Ruth before allowing it to cool. Pritchard, summoned from the yard, brought the key to the small lockable cupboard at the rear of the feed room. Hales placed the sealed sack inside. The key stays where it normally stays, Ruth said before anyone could suggest otherwise. Pritchard looked relieved. His established ring already held the feed room cupboard key among several others. But any opening is entered by Mr. Hales, Marcus said. Even if I order it. Hales gave a brief nod. Yes, Your Grace. The used Kemp sack was folded, labelled with the holding name and date received, and placed separately on the upper shelf. Ruth was grateful. Marcus did not turn the procedure into theatre. No servants were summoned to watch. No announcement went to the house. When the cupboard door closed, the room looked almost ordinary again. Goulding seemed to resent that more than he would have resented accusation. Are we finished? He asked. Not quite, Marcus said. He looked at Ruth. Who in Winchester? She named 2 feed merchants her uncle had once dealt with and added a third mill factor she knew only by reputation. Someone who has no reason to please Larkmead would be best. Marcus glanced at Goulding. Can the purchasing office arrange that? Goulding's face became careful. Of course, Ruth said. I would rather Mr. Hales write directly. Silence followed. Marcus turned toward her. Why? Because Mr. Goulding's office is one of the things we are testing. If there is an innocent warehouse error, an independent inquiry will clear it more cleanly. Goulding's voice sharpened. You are implying that I would interfere. No, I am preventing the possibility from becoming part of the argument later. Hale looked down quickly, perhaps hiding approval. Marcus considered Ruth for several seconds. She could feel the old amusement somewhere behind his attention, but it had changed its nature. He was no longer waiting for the companion to overreach. He was listening for whether she would. Mr. Hales writes directly, he said. Goulding's jaw tightened. As Your Grace wishes. After he left, The feed room seemed larger. Marcus remained beside the table while Hales carried his daybook toward the farm office to prepare the letters. Ruth closed the home farm account book. "You expected him to object," Marcus said. "I expected him to dislike losing control of a question. That is not the same thing." "No." "Do you think he has done something dishonest?" Ruth looked through the open doorway toward the yard, where 2 men were rolling a barrow past the cattle pens. She thought of how easily a suspicion could move through a farm once given a name. "I don't know yet." Marcus said nothing. Ruth turned back. "I mean that. I know the mark is wrong for the account entry. I know a second holding had the same mark. I do not know whether the supplier sent poor goods, whether the wrong grade was ordered, whether carriage or handling explains part of the price, or whether someone concealed anything. I would rather be slow than wrong." His expression softened, not into amusement this time, but into respect. "That is an inconvenient answer." "For whom?" "Everyone who prefers certainty before lunch." Ruth almost smiled. Then they should avoid farms. By afternoon, the first consequence of the sealed sack arrived without invitation. Mr. Kemp came to Home Farm carrying 2 folded account papers. With him were Mr. Sayer from a neighboring tenancy and Mr. Wilkes from farther along the western road. The 3 men stood just inside the office, hats in hand, plainly uncertain whether asking questions of Miss Quenby counted as disloyalty to the estate. Kemp spoke first. "We heard you were comparing feed deliveries." Ruth did not ask how he had heard. "Farms carried news more efficiently than post. I am comparing home farm records." "Would you look at ours?" Sayer asked. Ruth glanced toward Marcus, who had not yet returned to the house and stood near the window, reading Hales's draft letter. He did not answer for her. "That mattered. I can look," Ruth said, "but I will not promise you have been overcharged, and I will not accuse anyone from a sack mark." Wilkes set his folded account on the desk. "We don't want an accusation, miss. We want to know what we paid for." Ruth looked at the 3 men, then at the sealed cupboard key on Pritchard's ring, where it belonged, then at the premium figures in the home farm book. One discrepancy had become 2 sacks. 2 sacks had now become 3 farmers asking the same question. Somewhere between Winchester, Goulding's purchasing office, and the cattle standing in Larkmead's yards, the estate's orderly figures had begun to lose their authority. By the 3rd week of October, Ruth had enough figures to know that Larkmead's purchasing system was not obviously economical, which was more dangerous than proving it expensive. An expensive system could be defended as necessary. A system that could not explain its own advantage invited questions from everyone who had been told not to ask them. 3 tenant accounts lay open across the home farm office table beside the brown leather farm book. Mr. Kemp sat opposite Ruth with his cap resting on one knee. Mr. Sayer stood near the stove, reading the same Winchester quotation for the 2nd time, as if repetition might make the number less surprising. The 3rd account belonged to Mr. Wilkes, who had left before noon to see to a lame cart horse, but had given Ruth permission to continue the comparison. None of the papers proved fraud. Ruth had written that sentence at the top of her working sheet because she wanted the warning in front of her as much as anyone else. Goulding's approved figure included terms that the independent quotations did not always match exactly. One merchant charged more for carriage. Another offered shorter credit. A 3rd listed feed by grade so clearly that Ruth felt a small, unreasonable gratitude toward the ink. But when she compared like with like as far as the records allowed, The estate arrangement did not emerge as the undeniable bargain everyone had assumed it to be. "This one is lower," Kemp said, tapping the second quotation. "For the grade listed, yes. And this one is nearly the same, even with carriage." "Yes. Then were we overcharged?" Ruth looked at him. "I do not know." Kemp sat back, disappointed. "You've been saying that for a fortnight, because it remains true." "What would make it untrue? Knowing what was ordered, what was delivered, and what each charge included. We have not yet had the unopened sack identified independently. Until then, I will not turn suspicion into arithmetic." Sayer folded his arms. "Mr. Goulding says nobody can run an estate by shopping from one merchant to the next like a housewife comparing tea." Ruth glanced at him. A housewife who compares tea may know more about value than a gentleman who never opens his own bills. Kemp laughed. Sayer tried not to. Ruth continued before the room could become comfortable. "The point is not to buy the cheapest sack. Cheap feed can become expensive if cattle waste it or need more of it. Premium feed can also be foolish if the improvement does not justify the cost. We compare useful result, not pride." On the far side of the office, Pritchard entered the morning milk yields into the trial sheet. For 10 days, Ruth had divided a small group of cattle by condition and measured the ration more carefully, using feed whose grade could be identified without dispute. The trial was deliberately small. She did not want success large enough to conceal its own cost. The first figures were promising, but not miraculous. Waste had fallen. Milk had steadied. That was all. Ruth trusted all more than a sudden transformation. Kemp studied his account again. "Suppose this saves me money before Lady Day." "Then you will have saved money." "That isn't what I mean." He looked toward the door, lowering his voice, though no one had entered. "I am behind on rent. Not badly enough for eviction, but enough that every letter from the estate office makes my wife pale. If I had some cash before Lady Day, could I bring part of what I owe here?" Ruth understood the question at once. "To Home Farm? To you." The room went quiet. Pritchard stopped writing. Sayer looked away with the embarrassed discretion of a man who had suddenly heard something more personal than farm accounts. Ruth chose her answer carefully. "No." Kemp's face fell. "Because you don't trust the money. Because I do not have authority to receive rent. But His Grace gave you the farm. He gave me management of Home Farm. He did not give me the estate rent book." Kemp frowned. "Mr. Goulding has taken arrears payments before. Mr. Goulding has authority I do not presently possess." "And if I would rather pay you?" Ruth felt the weight of the question far beyond the amount Kemp might eventually put on a desk. Preference does not create lawful authority. If I took your money without the right to enter it properly, I would be doing exactly what I am asking you not to accept from anyone else. A voice from the doorway said, "That is inconveniently consistent." Marcus stood there, with rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. Ruth had not heard him approach. Kemp rose immediately. "Your Grace." Marcus nodded. "Sit, Mr. Kemp. You were asking Miss Quenby whether you could pay arrears through her." Kemp looked mortified. "Only if I can afford something, Your Grace." And she refused. "Yes." Marcus looked at Ruth. "Correctly." Something in Kemp's expression shifted. Could she be given authority? Marcus did not answer at once. His gaze moved to the account papers, then to Ruth. "Perhaps, if there is a reason beyond convenience," Ruth said, "there would need to be proper entry, a clerk present, clear limits, and no implication that I can alter what is owed." Marcus's eyes sharpened with interest. "You have already considered it." "Only since Mr. Kemp asked." "That was nearly a full minute ago." Remarkable efficiency. Kemp smiled despite himself. Marcus did not promise anything. Ruth was glad. Instead, she said, "First prove whether your changes actually leave these men with more usable cash. Then we can discuss what authority follows." The answer disappointed Kemp less than Ruth expected, perhaps because it was not no. After the tenants left, Marcus remained long enough to examine the Winchester quotations. Isaac Goulding arrived before Ruth could put them away. His glance fell on the papers immediately. Independent merchants again. Independent quotations, Ruth corrected. No purchase has been made outside the authority already granted. Goulding picked up one sheet. You are encouraging tenants to distrust an arrangement built over years. A good arrangement survives comparison, and a foolish comparison ignores credit, carriage, volume, and reliability. Then include them. Marcus leaned one shoulder against the window frame. That seems fair. Goulding turned toward him. Your Grace, the preferred system exists because fragmented purchasing weakens bargaining power. Then its numbers should prove it. Goulding's mouth tightened. Numbers do not capture relationships. Ruth said, they should still capture what the relationship costs. Marcus looked between them. Continue the comparison. No new extraordinary expenditure. No compulsory change for tenants. If Mr. Goulding's arrangement is better, the figures will defend him more effectively than I can. Goulding folded the quotation once too sharply and put it back on the desk, as your Grace wishes. By the time he left, rain had strengthened enough to drum against the office window. Ruth intended to postpone the drainage inspection, but Pritchard reported that the cleared western ditch was finally carrying water cleanly into the lower channel. She took her coat. Marcus looked at the weather. You are going now. The ditch has been waiting several years. I think it can bear 5 more minutes, but not my curiosity. Then I shall come and ruin another pair of boots. The lower field smelled of wet earth and crushed grass. The worst standing water had receded, leaving dark patches where the ground still needed time to recover. Pritchard walked ahead to inspect the outlet, while Ruth and Marcus followed along the ditch bank. Near the far end, a narrow plank crossed a deeper cut where the men had opened the channel. Rain had made the wood slick. Marcus crossed first. On the other side, he turned and held out his hand. He did not tell Ruth she needed it. He simply waited. Ruth looked at his offered hand and remembered their gloved fingers touching over the account book at Michaelmas. That had been accident. This was choice. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed firmly around hers while she stepped onto the wet plank. Ruth crossed without difficulty, but when both her boots reached solid ground, Marcus did not release her immediately. One breath passed, then another almost did. Ruth became aware of the warmth of his hand through her glove, the rain on his sleeve, and the fact that she had not withdrawn either. His eyes met hers. No amusement now, no audience. Marcus released her first, safely delivered, a triumph for the peerage. I expect a plaque. Ruth looked toward the cleared ditch to hide her smile. Water moved steadily where there had been stagnation weeks before. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but visibly. Behind them, Larkmead's accounts remained unresolved. The red-stamped unopened sack still secured in the locked home farm cupboard, and Goulding's authority still shadowed every purchasing question. Ahead, one tenant had already asked whether the money he might save could someday be placed in Ruth's hands. Marcus had not said yes. More importantly, he had not said no. On the morning of November 14th, Ruth watched Mr. Hales unlock the small cupboard at the rear of the home farm feed room and knew that whatever happened in Winchester would change the argument. Until that moment, the red-stamped sack had remained a question preserved behind a wooden door. Hales checked the daybook first. The original cord was still intact beneath the second binding he had added in October, and the estate seal showed no break. Pritchard stood beside him, while Hales recorded the time, the condition of the sack, and the names present. No one made ceremony of it. Ruth preferred that. 2 stablemen carried the sack to the rear of Marcus's carriage and secured it beneath a leather cover. The Dowager Duchess had sent her elderly maid to accompany Ruth, and the woman settled opposite Mr. Hales with the composed expression of someone who had chaperoned enough inconvenient journeys to consider evidence merely another form of luggage. Winchester lay roughly 8 miles away. The November road was damp but passable, and the carriage made steady progress through hedged lanes and open stretches of Hampshire farmland. Ruth sat beside Marcus without touching him. Since the afternoon at the drainage ditch, she had become too aware of the possibility of touch to treat proximity carelessly. Marcus seemed equally conscious of it, though he spoke only of the case. "You are unusually quiet." Ruth looked out at a field where cattle stood near a low stone trough. "I'm trying not to decide what we'll find before we find it. A difficult discipline. For you, for everyone." He glanced toward Hales, who was reviewing his notes, particularly people with estates, apparently. "We prefer answers that arrive already tied with ribbon." Ruth almost smiled. Evidence is less useful when everyone assumes someone else is minding it. Marcus's mouth curved. "You are becoming severe." "Home farm is educational. It has certainly improved my boots." She looked at him then, and the memory of mud almost drew a laugh from her. The moment softened, but did not become intimate enough to disturb the careful distance between them. By late morning, they reached the Winchester merchant's premises, a substantial brick building behind a counting house where carts stood beneath a covered yard. The merchant himself, Mr. Farrow, received them in a private room. Once Marcus explained that the inquiry concerned Larkmead's own purchases. Hales had the sack brought in before anyone opened it. He checked the wax and recorded that the outer sealing cord remained unbroken. Mr. Farrow leaned over the red mark without touching the cloth. "That's ours," he said, "or rather, our contracted mills." Ruth felt her pulse quicken. Marcus asked, "And the grade?" Farrow looked closer. "Second winter mixture," he straightened, "not premium." Goulding's explanations still had room to survive. Ruth reminded herself of that immediately. A wrong sack could still have been substituted after dispatch. A reused sack could still carry different contents. Marcus looked toward Hales. "Open it." Hales recorded the instruction before cutting only the added sealing cord. Then, with everyone watching, he cut the original fastening for the first time. The sack opened with a dry whisper of coarse meal and mixed grain. Farrow took a small measure into a shallow tray, examined it by hand, then called in one of his senior warehouse men. The second man reached the same conclusion. The contents matched the second-grade marking. Ruth did not feel triumph. She felt the question narrow. Marcus asked, "What would Larkmead have paid for this grade?" Farrow named the figure from that season. Hales wrote it down. Ruth compared it, silently, with the home farm entry she had copied before leaving. The supplier's figure was lower. The home farm book carried a substantially higher charge, consistent with premium material. Marcus saw her expression. How much difference? She gave him the figures. Farrow frowned. That isn't what we charged the Larkmead purchasing account for this grade. Marcus's attention sharpened. Can you show us what was ordered? Farrow hesitated only long enough to consider the propriety of displaying his commercial records. For your own account, yes. He sent for the dispatch ledger. When it arrived, the book was opened on the table between them. Hales compared dates from home farm deliveries with entries recorded under Larkmead's purchasing office. Ruth followed one line, then another. The grade was not ambiguous. Second winter mixture. The same grade appeared repeatedly. Not once, not in one mistaken week. Repeatedly. Marcus's face lost all remaining humor. Who placed these orders? Farrow ran one finger down the purchaser column. Instructions came through Mr. Goulding's office. Ruth looked at Marcus. Neither spoke. Hales continued copying dates, quantities, and grade references with Farrow's permission. Ruth forced herself to remain exact. This proves Mr. Goulding's office knowingly ordered second grade, she said. Marcus's eyes stayed on the ledger, and home farm was entered at the higher figure. Yes, then we have our answer. No, he looked at her. Ruth kept her voice quiet. We have part of it. The supplier sold Larkmead second grade feed at one figure. Home Farm's books carried a substantially higher figure, consistent with premium material. That proves the two sides do not match transparently. It doesn't prove where the difference went. Farrow nodded once. There can be carriage, credit, handling, allowances, consolidated terms. Ruth said, Exactly. Until those are traced, we know there is a discrepancy. We do not yet know who benefited from it. Marcus studied her for a long moment. You are determined to deny me a villain before luncheon. I'm determined not to give you the wrong one. Something in his expression changed, but he said nothing more. Hales finished the necessary extracts. The sack was retied with fresh cord, resealed under his supervision, and marked in the record as opened once before witnesses and secured again. They left Winchester shortly after 2. The return road seemed quieter. The dowager's maid eventually closed her eyes. Though Ruth suspected she remained awake, Hales occupied himself with copied references. Marcus watched the countryside for several miles before speaking. My father nearly ruined Larkmead once. Ruth turned toward him. The words carried none of his usual wit. I didn't know. Very few people do. He kept his gaze on the road beyond the glass. Not through vice. That would almost have been easier to understand. He believed in improvements, companies, schemes, new ventures recommended by men who always seemed to arrive with excellent tailoring and very little risk of losing their own money. Marcus gave a humorless smile. I was 27 and furious with anyone who used the word innovation. Ruth waited. He continued. When I inherited responsibility for more of the estate, I built rules, reviews, offices, comparative accounts. I wanted no single enthusiastic idea to be able to surprise Larkmead again. Ruth understood then why Goulding's orderly systems had appealed to him and why her challenge had first amused rather than alarmed him. A system doesn't become sound merely because it looks orderly from the house, she said. Marcus looked at her. Ruth continued. Someone still has to ask whether the entries match the feed, the cattle, and the men paying the bills. He did not defend himself. I laughed at you for asking. You did. You accepted the farm anyway. You gave me authority. After making it a joke. Ruth held his gaze. Both things can be true. The carriage rocked gently over a rut. Their hands rested separately, hers in her lap, his against the seat beside him. Neither closed the distance. The restraint made his next words more intimate than a touch would have been. I think I preferred systems because systems do not embarrass a man in public. People do. You have managed it, repeatedly. I haven't charged you for the service. His quiet laugh returned, but only briefly. At dusk, the carriage rolled back through Larkmead's gates. Hales accompanied the resealed sack directly to the main house, where the estate solicitor maintained a locked storage room for papers and disputed property. Ruth watched the transfer entered in writing before the door closed. Only then did she return toward Home Farm. The red-stamped sack was no longer there. It now rested under the solicitor's custody exactly because it had become more than a farm curiosity. Winchester had answered one question. Goulding's office had deliberately ordered cheaper feed. Home Farm had been charged far more than the supplier received for it. Ruth still did not know where the difference had gone. That was the question capable of ruining more than a luncheon conversation. By the first week of December, Ruth had learned to distrust improvements that arrived too quickly. Home Farm was better than it had been in October, but not dramatically so. The western drainage carried water more cleanly after rain. Feed waste had fallen because Pritchard's men were no longer issuing the same ration by habit to every animal. The dairy figures had steadied. 2 steers had sold respectably at a local market, not for extraordinary sums, but well enough to improve the farm's winter cash position. None of it was miraculous. Ruth trusted it for that reason. She sat in the Home Farm office on a cold Tuesday morning with the brown leather account book open before her, comparing feed use against milk yield when Mr. Kemp appeared at the door with his cap in one hand and a small leather purse in the other. Ruth recognized the purse before she understood why seeing it made her heart tighten. Weeks earlier, Kemp had asked whether he could bring arrears directly to her if the farm changes left him with enough cash. She had told him she lacked the authority. He had remembered, "Good morning, Miss Quenby." "Mr. Kemp." She looked toward the purse. "You have either sold something or come to frighten me." He smiled. 2 calves yesterday, not for a fortune. Did you accept the first offer?" "No. Your lectures have made me difficult." "Then I am pleased to have corrupted you." He came farther into the room. Mr. Hales sat at a smaller table near the window, entering copies from the estate correspondence. His presence had become familiar enough that tenants now spoke in front of him without looking as though they were confessing crimes. Kemp placed the purse on Ruth's desk but kept one hand over it. "You said if I had enough cash before Lady Day, I should not assume I could pay you." "Correct. I have enough for a small installment. Not all I owe. And enough left for your household and stock?" "Yes." "Feed for the next fortnight?" "Yes." "Wages?" "Covered." Ruth studied his face. "Then you have done well." Kemp shifted. "I have also come to ask the same question again." Hales looked up. Ruth knew the answer had not changed merely because she wished it had. "I still cannot receive rent without authority." "I know." Kemp glanced toward the yard, then back at her. "But I would rather bring it here than to Mr. Goulding's office." Ruth heard the carefulness in his voice. He did not accuse Goulding. Neither did she. The Winchester evidence proved that Goulding's office had ordered second-grade feed, while Home Farm carried far higher charges. It still did not prove where the difference had gone. The red-stamped sack remained under the solicitor's locked custody at the main house. Ruth had no intention of letting suspicion outrun proof. "Preference is not authority," she said. "You told me that before. Then I am becoming repetitive. Only because I am stubborn." A familiar voice behind him said, "That quality appears to be spreading across the estate." Marcus entered carrying a narrow leather document case. Kemp stood at once. "Your Grace?" Marcus nodded, then looked at the purse on Ruth's desk. "I assume I have arrived at an interesting moment." Ruth said, "Mr. Kemp wishes to make a voluntary payment against his arrears, and wishes to make it here." Kemp looked uncomfortable. "If that is proper, Your Grace." Marcus set the document case on the desk. "It is proper now." Ruth looked at him sharply. He opened the case and removed a folded paper. "After Mr. Kemp asked the first time, I had Mr. Hales prepare a limited authority. I did not issue it until Home Farm's figures showed that this was more than sentiment." Hales rose and came to the desk. Marcus handed the paper to him first. "Read it." Hales did. The authority was narrow. Ruth could receive and countersign voluntary installments against existing arrears from the 3 tenancies whose feed accounts were already under review. An estate clerk had to witness every payment. Each sum had to be entered in duplicate. Ruth could not reduce rent, forgive arrears, alter terms, or hold the money personally beyond the ordinary transfer procedure. Ruth read the document herself after Hales finished. "This does not make me a general rent receiver." "No. And it ends if the 3-account review ends, unless renewed." "Good." Marcus's expression warmed faintly. "You sound disappointed. I sound relieved." Kemp looked between them. "Then I may pay." Ruth turned to him. "If you still wish to, and if the payment does not leave you short." It does not. Only then did he remove his hand from the purse. He opened it and counted the coins onto the desk. £4.10. Ruth counted once. Hales counted separately. Their totals matched. He entered the sum against Kemp's arrears and prepared duplicate receipts. Ruth read every line before signing beneath his entry. One copy remained for the estate books. The other she handed to Kemp. He stared at it for several seconds. "Your account now shows this amount paid," Ruth said. "The remaining arrears are still due." "I know." He turned the receipt over once in his hand. "My wife will be glad to see this," Ruth smiled. "Keep it somewhere dry." Kemp did not smile back immediately. "Last winter, I stopped opening letters from the estate office unless she was in the room." Ruth's expression softened. "Why?" "Because if the letter said we were further behind, I wanted someone else there when I read it." The words changed the room. Marcus looked away first, toward the frosted window. Kemp continued, more quietly. "I thought the farm was failing because I was bad at it. Perhaps some of it was me. But if I was paying too much for poor feed..." He stopped. Ruth did not let anger answer for evidence. "We are still proving what happened." "I know." He folded the receipt carefully. "But this says I paid something. That is enough for today." After Kemp left, Hales took the coins and estate copy to the main office according to the written procedure. The home farm room became quiet. Ruth remained standing beside the desk with Marcus's document open before her. Through the window, Kemp crossed the yard with the receipt inside his coat. Marcus said, "You look as if the victory has offended you." "It has not." "Then what has?" Ruth closed the document. "Nothing has offended me." "That answer is too polished to be true." She looked at him. Weeks of working beside Marcus had made it more difficult to retreat behind courtesy because he had begun to recognize when she used it as a door. "Mr. Kemp trusted me with money because I was useful to him." "Yes, that can be temporary." Marcus said nothing. Ruth looked down at the account book. "I know what it is to be valued while there is a difficult task no one else wishes to do. A woman may become indispensable for a season and inconvenient the moment the season ends. You think that is what will happen here. I think usefulness is not the same thing as belonging." The truth surprised her after she said it. Marcus's expression lost its humor. He came to the opposite side of the desk, but stopped there. And failure frightens you less. Failure can be measured. Ruth gave a small, humorless smile. Being treated as a novelty cannot. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he placed one hand on the desk between them, palm upward. He did not reach across the distance. He simply offered. Ruth looked at his hand. At the drainage ditch, his touch had been practical. This was not. There was no plank beneath her feet, no mud to cross, no excuse except the fact that he had heard something she rarely said aloud. Marcus waited. Ruth could have stepped away. Instead, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed slowly around hers. He held her without tightening, and the stillness of the gesture made Ruth more aware of it than any boldness could have done. "I won't ask you to believe in my respect," he said quietly. "I'll have to behave as though it exists." Ruth's throat tightened. "That sounds inconvenient. I have been told inconvenience is educational." She almost laughed. Neither released the other. The cold office, the ledgers, the winter yard beyond the window all seemed to recede around the simple fact of his hand, holding hers because she had chosen to put hers there. Marcus did not draw her closer. Ruth did not need him to. After several breaths, she tightened her fingers once around his. His eyes changed. She saw that he understood the answer. Only then did she withdraw. Marcus let her go immediately. "We shall see how well your grace behaves," she said. A faint smile returned. "There will be an examination." "There is always an examination." "I feared as much." Ruth closed the rent authority and set it beside the home farm accounts. One tenant had brought her money because careful management had created enough room for him to pay without starving the winter ahead. That mattered more than praise. It also made the threat to Goulding's position visible in a new way. If better purchasing could turn anxiety into cash, then someone who profited from the old arrangement had more to lose than reputation. Ruth did not yet know that, before the week ended, Goulding would obtain a genuine invoice showing her replacement premium feed cost nearly 15% more per sack than the old estate figure. He would not need to falsify a single number to make it dangerous. January 7th brought a hard white frost to Larkmead, and with it the first public attack. Ruth could not answer by measuring anything before noon. The winter stock gathering had been arranged long before she took charge of Home Farm. Tenant farmers came to inspect cattle. Neighboring landowners arrived in dark coats and polished boots. Two agricultural gentlemen from Winchester moved between the pens, discussing condition, feeding, and sale weight, with the solemn pleasure of men who believed livestock became more respectable examined in company. Ruth had no intention of becoming part of the exhibition. By 11 o'clock, Isaac Goulding made certain that she did. He approached the central weighing shed, carrying a folded invoice, and waited until Marcus stood within hearing of several tenants, Lady Mildred Stoner, and 3 visiting landowners. His manner was grave enough to imply reluctance. "Your Grace, I'd have preferred to discuss this privately, but Miss Quenby's methods have been praised publicly. I believe the cost should be understood publicly as well." Ruth recognized the paper before Marcus opened it. It was the genuine invoice for the correctly identified premium feed she had ordered for the Home Farm trial. The amount had never been hidden. That was what made it dangerous. Marcus read the figure once. Goulding continued, "The price per sack is nearly 15% higher than the figure under the established estate arrangement." A low murmur, moved through the men nearest the shed. Ruth kept her hands still at her sides. Goulding turned slightly so the group could hear him without appearing to address an audience. Home farm cattle have improved. I do not dispute that, but any amateur can improve stock if allowed to buy dearer feed and call the expenditure reform. Ruth felt the word amateur land more effectively than an accusation of dishonesty would have done. Lady Mildred, standing near the covered rail with two ladies from a neighboring estate, looked toward Ruth with composed amusement. "Perhaps that is the difficulty with playing at farming," she said. "Someone eventually receives the bill." A few restrained smiles appeared. Marcus did not smile. Ruth looked at him and saw not anger, but calculation. That unsettled her more. "May I answer?" she asked. "Of course," Marcus said. Ruth stepped toward the invoice without taking it from his hand. "The price is higher because the product is not the same grade." Goulding's expression remained patient. "We have heard that before," because it remains true. Ruth turned enough to include the tenants. The older purchasing arrangement bought second-grade feed. We confirmed that from the Winchester supplier's own dispatch book. The home farm accounts nevertheless carried a substantially higher charge consistent with premium material. The invoice Mr. Goulding is holding is for correctly identified premium feed. Goulding nodded as though she had assisted him. "Exactly. More expensive feed. Different feed. And you have not yet proved that the higher grade produces better net economy." Ruth felt the trap close because the statement was fair. The trial is still being measured. "Then we agree." Goulding looked toward the visiting gentleman. "Miss Quenby is experimenting at the estate's expense before she has established that the expense is justified. Within the budget His Grace gave me, a budget can still be spent badly, so can a cheaper figure." A tenant near the rail shifted his weight. Ruth continued, "Purchase price alone does not tell you cost. We have to include grade, consumption, waste, condition, dairy return, and what the animal produces." One of the neighboring landowners asked, "But has the suspected difference in the old system been proved beyond the lower grade orders?" Ruth could have protected herself with implication. She did not. "No, we have proved that second-grade feed was repeatedly ordered through Mr. Goulding's office, while Home Farm carried substantially higher charges. We have not yet proved where the difference went, or whether carriage, credit, handling, or another legitimate cost explains part of it." The murmur changed. Goulding seized the opening at once. "There, Your Grace. That is precisely my concern. No fraud has been proved. Only that I purchased an economical grade and Miss Quenby purchased a dearer one." Ruth looked at him, and that the accounts did not show the distinction clearly. Estate accounts are not written as lessons for every tenant. Perhaps they should be understandable to the people paying them. A sharper silence followed. Marcus lowered his gaze to the invoice. Ruth knew the shape of his fear because he had entrusted it to her on the return journey from Winchester. His father had nearly destabilized Larkmead by embracing schemes that looked brilliant until the risk arrived. Marcus had rebuilt the estate around systems, reviews, professional officers, and figures that could be compared. Ruth had thought his confession meant he understood how fear governed him. She had not understood how quickly that fear would return when men whose opinion mattered were watching. A second visiting landowner said, "If I may, Rivenhall, a temporary restriction until the full accounts are examined would hardly be unreasonable." Marcus looked up. His gaze moved across the gathering before it returned to Ruth. She saw the mistake before he spoke. He was deciding how not to look foolish until the complete account review is finished. He said, "Miss Quenby's independent purchasing authority is suspended." The words were quiet. They did not need force. Ruth felt something inside her go still. Marcus continued immediately. "Her management of Home Farm remains in effect. Labor allocation, stock supervision, ration planning, drainage work, access to the books, and the limited authority already granted regarding the 3 participating rent accounts are unchanged. No one here is accusing Miss Quenby of dishonesty." Goulding lowered his eyes with the careful modesty of a man who had won without wanting anyone to see him enjoy it. Marcus turned toward Ruth. "This is temporary. Temporary things can still teach permanent lessons," she said, his jaw tightened. Ruth, the use of her Christian name before witnesses made the wound worse rather than better. She lowered her voice. "Not here." Marcus stopped. Ruth opened the leather case she carried and removed the original purchasing warrant he had given her at Michaelmas. She held it out. Marcus took it. Their fingers did not touch. She made certain of that. A young stockman standing beside Pritchard had been waiting with a question about the afternoon ration. Ruth saw him glance toward her, then toward Marcus, uncertain which authority still counted. The movement lasted only a second. It hurt more than Mildred's mockery. That was what Marcus's decision had done. Not merely limited a signature. It had taught the yard that Ruth's authority remained real only while the Duke felt comfortable defending it. Ruth turned to the stockman before Marcus could speak. "The ration schedule stands. Follow the quantities already entered this morning." The young man looked once more at Marcus. Marcus said, "You heard Miss Quenby." The confirmation came too late to erase the first glance. Ruth faced Marcus again. "I gave the tenants my word until Lady Day. Your doubt does not release me from mine." His expression changed. "I'm not asking you to leave Home Farm. No, you are asking me to remain after showing everyone here that the first time my judgment became socially inconvenient, you reduced it before them. I am asking for the accounts to be completed. Then complete them." Goulding stepped forward with an expression of professional sympathy. "Miss Quenby, no reasonable person will think less of you because an experiment is being reviewed." Ruth turned to him. "Then you will have no objection to the same review examining the purchasing system you managed." A flicker passed across his face. "Naturally. Good." Ruth addressed Pritchard and the tenants nearest the shed. "Home Farm continues under the present rationing and stock plan. Existing feed is measured. Dairy yields remain recorded. No new independent purchase order will be signed by me until His Grace restores that authority." Mr. Kemp spoke from the rear. "And our accounts?" "Miss?" Ruth looked at him. "Bring them as before. I may not order feed, but I can still compare what arrived with what you were charged." Marcus's eyes lifted sharply. Ruth saw understanding reach him. He had taken purchasing authority from her. He had not taken the carrier's memories, the tenant's papers, the farm books, or the facts already outside Goulding's office. She gathered her notebook from the weighing table. Marcus stepped toward her. Ruth stepped back once, not dramatically, only enough to make the boundary unmistakable. He stopped. "I have work to do, Your Grace." "Ruth, you made the decision publicly. When there is something to correct publicly, we can discuss it." She turned toward Home Farm. Kemp and 2 other tenants fell into step several yards behind her. Ruth did not resign. She did not leave Larkmead. She did not give Goulding the easier victory of turning humiliation into surrender. Before she reached the office, she had already decided where to look next. Goulding controlled purchase orders. He did not control every man who had carried a sack from Winchester, every delivery counterfoil, or every tenant who remembered what arrived at his door by the morning after the winter stock gathering. Ruth understood that remaining at Larkmead would require more discipline than leaving it. Departure would have given everyone an easy explanation. Miss Quenby had been embarrassed, and Miss Quenby had gone. Staying meant allowing the same men who had watched Marcus reduce her authority to see her continue. Working without pretending the wound had not mattered. Before breakfast, she was already in the dairy, comparing the week's yield against the ration book. By 9, she had inspected the western drainage and adjusted the feeding schedule for 2 cattle whose condition had changed. At 11, Pritchard brought her a request for another order of meal and stopped before placing the paper on her desk. "I suppose this goes to Mr. Goulding now." Ruth looked at the figures. "The purchase order does. The decision about how much we actually need does not." She recalculated the quantities, reduced one line that still reflected the older ration, and handed the sheet back. "Send this amount through the purchasing office." Pritchard hesitated. "You could have left after yesterday." "I could have. Most people expected you would." Ruth closed the home farm book. "Then most people have learned something useful." She did not tell him what. The truth was less elegant than courage. She remained because Mr. Kemp still carried arrears, because 2 of the 3 participating tenants were only just beginning to recover winter cash, because leaving in anger would force farmers to pay for a mistake Marcus had made. She would not offer Goulding that victory. The purchasing warrant was gone from her hands, but Home Farm still belonged to her management until Lady Day. She intended to use every inch of authority that remained. The first new pressure arrived on January 10th, when Mr. Sayer came to the office with an account sheet folded so tightly that the paper had split along one crease. "If feed keeps costing what it did last winter, I'll have to sell 2 beasts before February ends," he said. Ruth looked up. "At market, if I'm fortunate, and if the buyers know you must sell," Sayer's mouth hardened, "then they'll price the urgency, not the cattle." That was the first time the investigation became a clock. A question about purchasing could be delayed. Livestock could not. Ruth asked him what delivery records remained at his holding. Sayer had 2 counterfoils and a household farm book in which his wife had written dates of winter deliveries, because she used them to plan cash. Ruth asked him to preserve both exactly as they were. "Don't add notes now," she said. "Don't improve the record because we know what we're looking for. You think Mr. Goulding cheated us? I think we know lower grade feed was ordered and higher charges appeared in the accounts. We do not yet know every reason for the difference." Sayer gave her a frustrated look. "You are determined not to accuse him." "I am determined that when an accusation is made, it survives being examined." Over the next several days, Ruth asked the same narrow questions across the 3 holdings already under review. She did not search Goulding's office. She did not ask servants to steal letters. She asked men who had driven carts what they remembered and tenants what papers they already possessed. The most useful answer came from a carrier named Mr. Bell, whose wagons had brought feed from Winchester to several Larkmead holdings over the previous 2 winters. Bell arrived at Home Farm carrying a narrow leather-bound counterfoil book beneath one arm and suspicion in every line of his face. "This stays mine," he said before sitting. "Of course. No estate clerk takes it away. Not without your permission, and I'm not here to say Mr. Goulding stole anything. Ruth nodded. Neither am I. That satisfied him enough to open the book. Mr. Hales sat at the second desk as witness, while Ruth compared Bell's entries with the dates already copied from tenant accounts. The pattern emerged without drama. Second-grade deliveries appeared repeatedly. Quantities matched the supplier dispatch references from Winchester closely enough to establish that the sacks were not accidental substitutes after arrival. Bell turned another page. There, that load went to Kemp and Sayer same day. Ruth followed the line. Beside the delivery notation was a shorter commercial remark in Bell's cramped hand. What does that mean? Bell leaned closer. Rebate against consolidated custom. Hales stopped writing. Ruth did not. Whose rebate? Couldn't tell you. Paid to the estate? Could be an allowance settled at the factor's end. Large accounts get arrangements ordinary buyers don't. Would you receive it? Bell snorted. Not unless someone suddenly became generous to carriers. Ruth looked at Hales. The notation did not prove where the money went. It proved something else. The old system had not merely purchased cheaper grade. It had generated commercial allowances connected to the volume of Larkmead's business. If those allowances belonged to Larkmead, they should appear somewhere in Larkmead's accounts. Ruth had never seen them. May Mr. Hales copy the wording and date? She asked. Bell considered. The wording only. Book stays here. Agreed. Hales made a careful extract while Bell watched. Ruth did not ask for more. When the carrier closed the book, she said, if the solicitor needs to inspect it, he will ask you directly. That'll do. Bell stood. At the door, he paused. Miss Quenby. Yes? Men have been telling me you were sent back to being a companion after yesterday. Ruth's face went still. Bell glanced toward the yard. Doesn't look much like it. People often prefer tidy stories. Farms rarely oblige. No, Ruth said. They do not. By late afternoon, Marcus had Hales's written summary. He came to Home Farm before dusk, alone, and stopped several feet inside the office rather than crossing directly to Ruth's desk. She noticed the distance because, before January, he would not have thought to create it. Bell's notation is enough for the solicitor to ask the Winchester factor for the Larkmead account, he said. Good. If the factor confirms rebates, we may finally know whether the higher internal charge concealed something legitimate or something else. Yes. Marcus took a folded document from inside his coat. Ruth recognized the shape before he opened it. I can restore your purchasing authority tonight. She looked at the paper but did not reach for it. On what basis? On the basis that I should not have suspended it. That is not the same as saying the evidence is complete. No. And how would you restore it? Marcus hesitated. The estate office could enter it immediately. Quietly, efficiently. Ruth almost smiled, but there was no humor in her. The men who saw you take the warrant from me did not see efficiency. They saw doubt. His expression tightened. I know. Do you? She stood. If you return authority privately, what will the stockman from yesterday believe? That you trust me publicly? Or that you indulge me when no one important is watching? Marcus lowered the paper. I am trying to repair what I did, then repair the thing you damaged. Silence held between them. Ruth wanted him close enough that she could forget the shed, the warrant, the glance of the young stockman. That was precisely why she did not cross the room. Marcus looked at her for several seconds before asking, What do you require? Complete the inquiry, then correct the decision before the same kind of witnesses who saw you make it. Even if Goulding uses the delay against you, He already is. Marcus's mouth tightened. I dislike this. So do I. That was not what I meant. Ruth met his gaze. I know. He folded the restoration order once and returned it to his coat. Very well. The solicitor examines the factor account. Your purchasing authority remains suspended until we have the evidence, and I can correct the matter properly. Ruth nodded. Thank you. A rueful expression touched his face. I have never been thanked so severely for not getting my way. Practice may improve you. This time he almost smiled. He did not step closer. He did not reach for her hand. The restraint hurt, but it also mattered. At the doorway, Marcus paused. Bell, Kemp, Sayer, and anyone else cooperating with the inquiry will not lose legitimate estate work because they spoke. Ruth considered the wording. That is not you taking over the investigation. No. It is me placing a boundary on my own people. Then it is useful. He left. Ruth remained beside the desk as winter darkness gathered beyond the window. The distance between them no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a test neither of them could complete by touch. Somewhere in Winchester, inside a factor's commercial account, lay the answer to a narrower and more dangerous question. The rebates existed. Ruth still did not know who received them. By the last week of January, the answer Ruth had refused to guess was finally written in someone else's books. Marcus's solicitor returned from Winchester with a signed extract from the factor's account, a short memorandum explaining the entries, and enough dates to connect the commercial allowances to Larkmead's feed purchases without relying on memory or implication. Mr. Hales brought the papers to Home Farm shortly before noon. Ruth read them standing beside the office table, because sitting felt impossible once she reached the third entry. The pattern was plain. Goulding's office had ordered second-grade winter feed. Larkmead's internal accounts had carried substantially higher charges. Periodic rebates tied to the volume of Larkmead's custom had then been credited, not to the estate account, but to an account identified with Isaac Goulding. Ruth read the line again. Personally, Hales nodded. That is how the factor records it. Not as an estate allowance temporarily held in his name. The solicitor asked the same question. Hales tapped the memorandum. The factor's clerk states the credits were treated as Mr. Goulding's account unless otherwise directed. Ruth felt anger rise, but the figures held it in place. Do we know whether he later returned any of it to Larkmead? Not yet. The estate books are being checked year by year. Ruth closed her eyes for one breath. This was the point at which accusation became evidence. She had imagined satisfaction. What she felt instead was the weight of Mr. Kemp's winter letters. Mr. Sayer considering an early stock sale, and farmers who had accepted poor results because respectable officers told them the system was efficient. Does His Grace know? She asked. He read the extract before sending it here. And Mr. Goulding? The solicitor has not confronted him yet. Ruth looked toward the yard. Marcus had given her weeks to prove what his own system had failed to see. Then he had taken part of that authority away when the proof became socially uncomfortable. Now the evidence had caught up with both of them. What happens next? Hales asked. We do not announce more than we can prove. Ruth looked back at the papers. We know the rebates were credited to Goulding. We do not yet know whether he will claim them as commissions, nor whether any were later returned. The accounts decide that. Hales gave a small nod. His Grace expected you to say something like that. Then he has become disturbingly predictable. Not in all matters. Hales allowed himself the faintest smile. There is a gathering at 3 in the cattle shed. the same tenant representatives and farm staff who were present when your purchasing authority was suspended have been asked to attend. Ruth's hand tightened around the memorandum. For what purpose? His Grace said he would explain that himself. At 3 o'clock, the cattle shed held no large audience, only the people who mattered. Mr. Kemp stood near the rail beside Mr. Sayer and 2 other tenant representatives. Pritchard was there with the young stockman who had looked from Ruth to Marcus after the January suspension. Hale stood beside the estate's solicitor at a trestle table. There were no neighbouring landowners, no Lady Mildred, and no Goulding. Marcus arrived carrying a folded document. Ruth chose a place near the table rather than beside him. He noticed. He did not ask her to move before we discuss the Winchester account. Marcus said, "I owe Miss Quenby a correction." The words settled over the shed more heavily than a speech would have done. He looked first at the workers and tenants who had witnessed his earlier decision. At the winter stock gathering, I suspended Miss Quenby's purchasing authority before the inquiry was complete. I told myself caution required it. He paused. That is not an adequate account of what I did. Ruth watched his face. There was no wit in it now, no polish. Miss Quenby's judgment was sound. My suspension was premature. I allowed my fear of appearing foolish before other men to carry more weight than the discipline she had already shown. I made her authority look conditional upon my comfort. The young stockman lowered his eyes. Ruth felt the memory of his glance across the yard as sharply as if it had happened that morning. Marcus continued. The error was mine. He did not look at Ruth for rescue. He did not say he had meant well. The solicitor then summarized the Winchester findings. Second-grade orders through Goulding's office. Higher internal charges. Rebates credited personally to Goulding rather than to Larkmead. He stopped there. No claim was made yet about whether those sums had later been returned. Mr. Kemp muttered something under his breath that Ruth chose not to hear. Marcus unfolded the document in his hand. Miss Quenby's purchasing authority should be restored. I am not going to decide the terms of that restoration without asking her. He turned toward Ruth. What repair do you require? Everyone else in the shed suddenly seemed intent on not looking directly at either of them. Ruth took her time. The same budget limits as before. Agreed. Independent quotations remain permitted. Agreed. And if my judgment is challenged again, you speak to me before changing my authority. Marcus held her gaze. Even if I believe you are wrong, especially then. A breath moved through his expression, almost a smile and not quite. Agreed. Ruth looked at the paper. This is not the old warrant. No, the original remains surrendered. This is a new one, dated today. Hales took it first, read the scope aloud, and entered the issue in the estate daybook. Only then did he pass it to Ruth. She checked every line. Ordinary home farm, purchasing within the established budget. Independent quotations permitted. Exceptional expenditure still required ducal approval. Nothing more, nothing hidden. She signed the acknowledgement and folded the new warrant into her leather case. Mr. Sayer asked, "Does this mean our feed arrangements change now?" Ruth answered before Marcus could. "It means Home Farm may purchase independently again. It does not mean every tenant should copy us. Your holdings have different cash, credit, and stock needs." Kemp looked toward the solicitor's papers. "And Mr. Goulding?" Marcus said, "His conduct is under formal review until the estate books establish whether the rebates were ever returned. I will not announce a conclusion the records have not completed." Ruth glanced at him. Months earlier, she had taught him that sentence without knowing it. He caught the look and understood. The meeting ended without applause. Ruth preferred that too. Pritchard returned to the yard. The tenants left in low conversation. Hales accompanied the solicitor toward the main house with the Winchester extract. Ruth remained beside the table, sorting the home farm papers into a neat stack. Marcus stayed several feet away until they were alone. "You asked me in January whether I understood what I had done," he said. Ruth looked up. "I remember. I did not then, not fully." He came one step nearer and stopped. "I thought I had limited a signature. I had actually told everyone watching that your authority could shrink the moment mine became uncomfortable." Ruth did not spare him. "Yes, I was wrong. Yes," he accepted both answers. "I cannot undo the moment. No, but I can refuse to repeat it." Something inside Ruth loosened, not because the apology was beautiful, but because he did not ask her to make it easier for him. Marcus's hand rested on the edge of the table between them. He did not offer it this time. Ruth looked at it, then at his face. In December, he had placed his palm upward and waited for her choice. Now he offered nothing, because he understood that even comfort could become a request too soon. Ruth crossed the small distance herself. She placed her fingers over the back of his hand. Marcus went completely still. His eyes lifted to hers. He did not turn his hand until she left hers there. Only then did he slowly rotate his palm beneath her fingers and close them gently around her own. Ruth felt the warmth through her glove. "This does not erase January," she said. "I know. It is not permission to become unbearable again." A faint smile touched his mouth. "That condition may be difficult." Ruth tightened her fingers once. "Practice. I seem to be doing a great deal of that. You need it." The smile warmed, but he did not step closer. After several quiet seconds, Ruth withdrew her hand. The distance returned without becoming cold. Before either could say more, hoofbeats sounded sharply in the yard. Mr. Hales appeared at the shed entrance holding a newly arrived letter. "Your Grace, Miss Quenby." Marcus turned. "What is it?" Hales broke the seal only after Marcus nodded and read quickly. His expression changed. "The Winchester factor is calling in outstanding feed credit from several Larkmead tenants. Payment is required sooner than the customary terms, and further deliveries may be withheld without cash settlement." Ruth felt the fragile calm of the afternoon disappear. "Which tenants?" Hales named Kemp, Sayer, and 3 others. Marcus's face hardened. "Golding?" Ruth looked at him immediately. "We do not know that." He stopped. Ruth continued, though every instinct told her the timing was not accidental. "It looks like retaliation. That is not the same thing as proof." Marcus nodded once. "Then we find out." Ruth looked toward the darkening yard, thinking of Sayer's warning about selling stock before February ended. The rebates had finally acquired a name. Now the question was whether someone had decided to punish the tenants for helping uncover it. The first clear proof that the credit crisis was not merely unfortunate timing arrived at Home Farm. 3 days later, folded inside a letter from the Winchester factor, and written in language cautious enough to reveal more than anger would have done. Ruth read the relevant passage twice before handing it to Marcus. The factor stated that customary indulgence had been shortened after Mr. Isaac Goulding advised that Larkmead's purchasing arrangements were under challenge, and that extended credit should not continue until authority was clarified. It was not an order. Goulding had no legal power to command the factor. It was influence used exactly where influence hurt most. By then, 5 tenants had received notices, and Mr. Sayer's warning about forced stock sales no longer sounded hypothetical. He sat at the home farm office table with Kemp and 2 other farmers while rain marked the windows in thin grey lines. "If I sell now," Sayer said, "the buyer will know why. I'll lose more in the bargain than I owe the factor." Kemp nodded. "And if we wait, we run short before the month ends." Marcus stood beside the stove with the factor's letter in his hand. "I can settle the outstanding balances from the estate account this afternoon." Ruth looked up. No. 4 tenants went very still. Marcus did not. That mattered. "The cattle cannot eat principal," he said. "I'm aware." "Then why no?" Ruth turned the blank side of one notice toward her and took up a pencil. "Because if you pay every balance, you save the tenants from this week and preserve the same system for next winter. The next factor only needs to know that when enough pressure is applied, the Duke pays. They need feed now, yes, so we buy feed." Marcus's brow tightened. "With what money?" Ruth looked at the tenants. "How much cash can each holding safely put toward 2 weeks of actual need without forcing a stock sale or leaving wages unpaid?" Sayer gave a figure. Kemp followed. The others did the same. Ruth wrote each amount separately. "And home farm?" Marcus asked. "We have enough cash for our own share, if we order only what the ration schedule requires." She added the numbers. Individually, these holdings have little bargaining power. Together, they have enough for a pooled cash order. Kemp leaned forward. "Through the same factor. No 2 independent suppliers if possible. Smaller lots. Clearly identified grade. No one merchant controls every delivery." Marcus looked at the page. "And after a fortnight, we repeat the calculation from actual consumption and actual cash. Dairy income weekly. Stock sale proceeds when they occur. No pretending money will arrive merely because a quarter date exists on the calendar." Sayer gave a bleak laugh. "That sounds almost too simple. Most useful things become complicated after someone begins profiting from the complication." Marcus's gaze flicked toward her. He understood the sentence was not yet an accusation beyond the proof. Ruth continued. "There is another difficulty. Tenants using the estate purchasing arrangement have been told they must obtain feed through the approved factor." Hales, seated at the second desk, nodded. "That instruction came through Mr. Goulding's office under delegated authority." Marcus's first instinct showed in the way his shoulders squared. Then he stopped. He looked at Ruth instead. "What do you want changed?" The question reached her more deeply than the tenants could have known. Months earlier, he would have issued a replacement rule before anyone else finished speaking. "Remove the compulsory channel," Ruth said. "Do not replace it with another compulsory supplier. Let every tenant choose independent purchase, pooled purchase, or the existing factor if he still prefers it." Marcus nodded. "Done." He turned to Hales. "Put it in writing. No Larkmead tenant is required to use the preferred factor for feed. Miss Quenby will chair the pooled purchasing arrangements, and no tenant is to suffer an estate penalty for choosing another merchant." He did not add instructions Ruth had not asked for. He did not take the pencil from her. That mattered too. By the following afternoon, the home farm cart shed had become an improvised purchasing room. 2 Winchester quotations lay on the table. Ruth compared grade, carriage, minimum order, and cash terms, while tenants pledged only what their holdings could safely bear. The Dowager Duchess was expected later to inspect the winter cattle, accompanied by Lady Mildred Stoner, whose visit had been arranged before the credit dispute began. Their presence was inconvenient, but not accidental. Ruth was explaining why one larger order should be divided between suppliers when Isaac Goulding entered the shed. He carried the factor's correspondence in one hand. "Your Grace," he said, "I understand 17 years of purchasing arrangements are being dismantled in an afternoon." Marcus remained near the doorway rather than at Ruth's shoulder. "A compulsory arrangement is being removed. Any tenant may continue using the factor voluntarily." Goulding looked at Ruth. "And this collection of cash purchases is supposed to replace commercial credit," Ruth answered. "It is supposed to prevent men being forced into bad stock sales because one intermediary can close the only door." The factor withdrew indulgence because the account itself became uncertain. Marcus lifted the letter. "At your recommendation." Goulding's face altered by a fraction. "I advised caution. The purchasing system was being publicly challenged. A responsible agent protects suppliers from confusion." "By tightening credit on the tenants helping examine your accounts?" Ruth asked. "I protected an arrangement that has served Larkmead for years. It served you particularly well." The words came from Lady Mildred, who had entered with the Dowager Duchess behind her. Goulding looked toward her, then recovered. "Lady Mildred misunderstands. I understand a great deal more when men stop assuming I do not." Mildred's tone was cool rather than friendly. She had not become Ruth's ally. That made what followed stronger. Goulding turned to Marcus. "There are questions about Miss Quenby's own independence that have not been examined with equal enthusiasm." Ruth said nothing. Marcus's expression hardened. "What questions?" Goulding glanced toward Mildred. "Lady Mildred may recall an occasion when Miss Quenby received some private consideration from a Winchester supplier. A parcel, perhaps, a gift not entered with the estate accounts." Mildred stared at him. "No." Goulding continued carefully. "At one of the autumn gatherings. You were present. I was present at many gatherings. Then perhaps you remember more clearly than—" "I remember enough." Mildred's voice sharpened. "I have called Miss Quenby presumptuous. I have questioned whether she belongs in the position His Grace gave her. I have never seen her accept a private gift from a supplier, and I won't invent one because your accounts have become inconvenient." Silence filled the shed. Ruth felt no affection for Mildred in that moment. She felt respect for a line the woman refused to cross. Marcus looked at Goulding. "You are suspended from all purchasing functions effective now. You will not issue supplier instructions, alter tenant purchasing arrangements, or represent estate authority to any merchant or factor without written approval from my solicitor." Goulding went pale. After 17 years, after evidence of undisclosed rebates, pressure applied through a preferred factor, and an attempt to manufacture corroboration where none exists. Those rebates were not theft. Goulding's control returned suddenly, driven by indignation. They were commissions. Informal, yes, but earned. I negotiated volume terms no tenant could have obtained alone. I carried risks and relationships this estate benefited from for 17 years. Ruth watched him closely. For the first time, she understood how he had justified the system to himself. He had not thought of the money as stolen, because he had decided his indispensability entitled him to it. Marcus asked, "Were those commissions disclosed in your terms of employment?" Goulding hesitated. "Not in formal wording. Were they disclosed to me?" "No." "Were they returned to the estate?" "Any surplus properly belonging to Larkmead was intended to be reconciled at year-end." Marcus's face became unreadable. "Then the estate books will show it." Goulding gathered his gloves. They will show 17 years of service. They may. They will also show the money. Goulding left without another word. The meeting resumed because Ruth refused to let his exit become the event's conclusion. By dusk, the first pooled orders were agreed. No duke had paid the debts. No tenant had been promised rescue. They had built another route. When the last farmer left, Ruth remained beneath the cart shed, collecting quotations. Marcus stood several feet away. "I nearly solved it with money," he said. "Yes, again, yes, you could occasionally pretend I improve faster." Ruth looked at him. "You did improve." He was quiet. "Because I asked. Because you listened to the answer." Something vulnerable passed through his face. "I am beginning to understand how often I have mistaken action for care." Ruth's chest tightened. He stepped closer, then stopped. "May I?" She knew exactly what he meant. January still existed between them. So did his apology. So did the fact that today, when pressure rose, he had asked rather than decided for everyone. Ruth crossed the remaining distance herself and put her arms around him. Marcus exhaled slowly. His arms came around her with careful warmth. No urgency, no claim. Ruth rested her cheek briefly against his coat and felt the steadiness of him beneath it. The embrace did not erase what had happened. It proved something had changed after it. When Ruth stepped back, Marcus released her immediately. Before either could speak, Hales appeared at the shed entrance, holding an estate ledger. "Your Grace." "Miss Quenby." Ruth turned. "What is it?" Hales looked from one to the other. "The solicitor has completed the comparison for 3 full years." Marcus's expression sharpened, and Hales held the ledger tighter. "There is no corresponding credit to Larkmead for Goulding's rebates in any of them." March 18th arrived bright and cold, the sort of morning that made every line of the home farm yard look sharper than usual. By 10 o'clock, the cattle pens had become the setting for something. Ruth had spent months refusing to call a trial. Tenant representatives stood near the rails. Mr. Bell, the carrier, had come with his counterfoil book under his arm. The Winchester supplier had sent a representative authorized to identify the dispatch entries and mill markings. Mr. Hales arranged the relevant estate books across a trestle table. The solicitor stood beside him with a narrow case of papers. Isaac Goulding waited several yards away, no longer carrying purchasing authority, but still composed enough to look as though he expected procedure to rescue him. Marcus stood near Ruth without standing over her. The distinction mattered. At precisely 10, the solicitor's clerk brought a sealed sack from the carriage and placed it on the side table. Ruth recognized the red stamp immediately. The outer fastening bore the solicitor's seal from locked custody at the main house. Mr. Hales checked the written record before the sack was touched. "This is the same home farm sack first preserved in October," he said. "It was opened once in Winchester on November 14th in the presence of witnesses, identified as second-grade feed. Then, retied, resealed, returned to Larkmead, and transferred to the solicitor's locked custody. The seal now before us is the one placed after that examination. No one needed more ceremony than that. The chain was clear. The sack had not wandered through servants' hands or reappeared mysteriously when useful." Ruth stepped toward the account book. "We began with one question," she said. "Did Home Farm receive what its records said it received?" She opened to the relevant autumn entries. The book carried a substantially higher charge, consistent with premium material. She indicated the sack. The physical feed found at Home Farm was marked second grade. Winchester confirmed the mark and the contents. The supplier's representative nodded and identified the mill notation. Ruth continued, before anyone could mistake that fact for the entire case. That did not prove where the money went. It proved only that the goods and the charge did not match transparently. Marcus watched her. Ruth moved to the second piece of evidence. The next question was whether the wrong grade appeared only once. Mr. Bell opened his counterfoil book himself. The original remained in his possession, exactly as he had required. He read several dated deliveries showing second-grade feed carried to Home Farm and participating tenant holdings. Mr. Hales matched those dates to Larkmead's internal charges. The pattern repeated. Goulding spoke for the first time. Because the estate arrangement included carriage, credit, handling, and negotiated commercial terms, comparing a supplier's simple price to an estate charge proves very little. Ruth turned to him, which is why we did not stop there. The solicitor unfolded the signed factor extract. The account connected with Larkmead's purchasing showed periodic rebates, allowed because of consolidated custom. Those rebates were credited to an account identified with Mr. Isaac Goulding personally. A murmur passed among the tenants. Goulding did not flinch. "Commissions," he said, "compensation for commercial relationships I maintained for this estate over 17 years. Marcus's voice remained level. "Were those commissions stated in your terms of employment?" Goulding looked at him, not in formal wording. "Were they disclosed to me?" "No." "Were they disclosed to the tenants whose purchasing arrangements helped generate them?" Goulding's mouth tightened. "The tenants were not parties to my compensation." Ruth said, "Then the remaining question is whether those sums were returned to Larkmead as you said they were intended to be." Mr. Hales opened 3 years of estate summaries. The answer required very few words. There was no corresponding annual credit, no reconciliation matching the rebates, no entry returning them to the estate. Goulding stared at the books, then at Marcus. The accounts were handled across several balances. There were adjustments that may not appear under the same description. "Then show us where," Marcus said. "The books are here." Goulding's jaw hardened. "I would need time." "You have had weeks." The silence that followed was not theatrical. It was worse for Goulding because everyone understood it. He had spent months arguing that the system was too complicated for Ruth to comprehend. Now complexity had become his final refuge. Ruth did not press him further. She turned to the Home Farm figures. The rebates establish what happened to part of the difference. The farm results answer a separate defense. Mr. Goulding argued that the old system was economical and my trial improved stock merely by spending more per sack. She kept the numbers brief. Feed waste had fallen. Milk returns had steadied. Cattle condition had improved through winter. 2 stock sales had produced respectable proceeds. Cost per useful result had improved because properly identified feed was measured against actual output rather than assumed to be cheaper because the sack price looked lower. There had been no miraculous harvest and no impossible transformation. Just less money disappearing between purchase and result. Mr. Kemp spoke from the rail. "It was enough that I paid an installment on arrears before Lady Day." Mr. Sayer added, "And enough that I didn't have to sell stock in January when the buyers would have known I was pressed." Ruth let their words remain theirs. She did not turn them into evidence of her virtue. Marcus stepped forward only after the figures were finished. Ruth knew before he spoke that the next words were not meant for Goulding. They were meant for the people who had heard something very different at Michaelmas And in January, when Miss Quenby first questioned Home Farm, I treated her judgment as entertainment. His gaze moved across the same class of tenants and workers who had heard him do it. I called her workplay because I did not understand it. Ruth felt the sentence settle through the yard. Marcus continued. Later, when her methods placed my own judgment under public pressure, I suspended part of her authority before the evidence justified it. I have already corrected that decision. I repeat the correction here because the original disrespect was public. He looked at Ruth. She did not succeed because I indulged her. She succeeded because she asked the questions my system had stopped asking. No applause followed. Ruth was grateful. Pritchard looked down briefly. Kemp removed his cap. The young stockman, who had once looked toward Marcus before obeying Ruth, now kept his eyes on her. That small change struck deeper than praise. Goulding exhaled slowly. So this is decided. Marcus turned to him. Your purchasing authority remains suspended. The solicitor will complete the account review and advise on recovery. Today establishes the record. Lady Day will determine the corrected tenant balances. Goulding's face hardened. You mean to make her the face of the estate's accounting now? Ruth answered before Marcus could. No, the records will remain the face of the accounting. Goulding looked at her with something colder than contempt, but contempt had failed him. He said nothing more. The gathering broke gradually. Bell closed his counterfoil book and took it with him. The supplier's representative signed the brief identification statement and departed. Mr. Hales watched while the solicitor resealed the red-stamped sack, recorded its condition and removal from the demonstration table, and had it carried back toward the main house for return to locked custody. Ruth did not look away until the evidence left the yard under the same control that had brought it there. Only then did she step toward the cattle rail. Marcus joined her, stopping beside rather than in front of her. Was that enough? He asked quietly. For what? For the correction. Ruth looked at the yard where months earlier she had been a woman whose authority could be laughed into existence. It was accurate. That is not the same answer. She turned toward him. It mattered that you said it here. Marcus nodded. I should have understood that sooner. Yes, he accepted the word without defense. His hand rested loosely against the top rail. Ruth looked at it, then at his face. She reached first. Her fingers closed briefly around his hand, hidden from most of the yard by the angle of the rail. Marcus went still. Ruth gave one small squeeze. Not absolution, not a promise, a choice. His fingers answered with the lightest pressure before she let go. Thank you, she said. His expression softened. I will try not to require so many public corrections in future. That would be economical. A faint smile appeared. Mr. Hales approached, carrying a fresh document. Your Grace, Miss Quenby, the Lady Day instrument is ready. Marcus took it, read the final wording, then handed it to Ruth. It was separate from her purchasing warrant and separate from the limited 3-tenancy authority issued in December. It appointed Miss Ruth Quenby temporary receiver on Lady Day for the named tenancies whose reviewed accounts were scheduled at the Home Farm table with duplicate receipts, clerked entries, and immediate transfer of funds through the ordinary estate procedure. Ruth read every line before signing acknowledgement. Only the named accounts. Only those, Marcus said, and only Lady Day. Yes. She folded the instrument carefully. 7 days remained. The evidence had answered what happened. Marcus had answered what he had done wrong. The next question no ledger could answer in advance. When the tenants came with money in their hands, Whom would they choose to trust? March 25th began with frost silvering the edges of the home farmyard and with Ruth awake before dawn. Not from fear of failure, but from the knowledge that the next few hours would make visible what 6 months of work had changed. By 9 o'clock, the trestle table stood beneath the open cart shed. Mr. Hales arranged the duplicate receipt books, cash box, reviewed tenant accounts, and the temporary Lady Day warrant Ruth had received 7 days earlier. The solicitor arrived from the main house carrying a narrow evidence case and accompanied by a clerk. From that case came the same red-stamped feed sack presented on March 18th, its seal and custody notation intact after being returned to the solicitor's locked storage. Hales checked the entry, verified the condition, and recorded its temporary removal for the day. The sack was placed on a side table, not because the case needed to be tried again, but because the consequence of the evidence was about to be carried into the estate books. Tenants gathered beyond the yard gate. Some came on foot, others arrived in carts. Several carried purses or folded papers inside their coats. Marcus stood near the solicitor rather than behind Ruth's chair. She noticed that immediately. Months ago, he had made her authority public by granting it with a joke. Today, he made no attempt to own the result. Before the first account was opened, the solicitor raised one hand for quiet. There are matters that must be entered into the estate record before rents are received. Isaac Goulding stood near the edge of the gathering under instruction. Without the easy authority that had once caused clerks and tenants to move aside when he approached, Marcus spoke first. Mr. Goulding's employment with Larkmead is terminated as of today. No one murmured. The directness of the sentence prevented spectacle. The solicitor continued. Goulding was required to surrender every remaining estate key, purchasing paper, account copy, and authority in his possession. Civil recovery would proceed for the undisclosed rebates already established and for any additional sums verified during the continuing review. Relevant evidence would be referred through proper legal channels. Tenant accounts affected by proved overcharges would be recalculated. Legitimate rent would remain due. No debt would disappear merely because another injustice had occurred beside it. Ruth watched Kemp absorb the distinction and nod. That mattered. Justice would mean correcting what could be proven, not rewarding everyone with a fiction because anger demanded something larger. Goulding listened with his face drawn tight. When the solicitor finished, he looked toward Marcus. "Your Grace, I served this estate for 17 years. Yes, I negotiated terms no ordinary tenant could have obtained. Then the savings should have appeared in Larkmead's accounts. I carried responsibilities beyond my formal salary. Then you should have asked to be paid for them openly." Goulding's eyes flicked toward Ruth. This would never have become a public disgrace without Miss Quenby. Ruth answered before Marcus could. "No, without me, it might have remained a private system." Goulding's mouth hardened. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not step between them. After a moment, the solicitor asked for the remaining keys. Goulding removed them from his coat and placed them on the table. Hales counted them against the office list. The sound was small, metal against wood. Yet Ruth remembered how often those keys had symbolized access nobody questioned. Now they were only objects being returned to the estate. Goulding gave Marcus a stiff bow and left the yard without another word. There was no cheering. Ruth was grateful for that too. Before the first tenant approached, Lady Mildred Stoner stepped forward from beside the Dowager Duchess. Her expression was composed, but there was no mockery in it. Miss Quenby. Ruth turned. Lady Mildred, I said publicly that your success at Home Farm might be nothing more than expensive enthusiasm. I repeated language that made your work sound like an amusement. Ruth waited. Mildred continued. I had no evidence for that beyond Mr. Goulding's invoice and my own opinion of your place here. I was wrong to make suspicion sound like knowledge. It was not affection. It was not friendship. It was better than either would have been if false. Thank you, Ruth said. Mildred inclined her head once and returned to the dowager's side. Mr. Hales opened the first account book. Mr. Kemp came forward. Of course he did. He removed his cap and placed a worn leather purse on the table before Ruth. Lady Day balance, he said, the reviewed amount. In full. Ruth felt the yard become quiet around them. She opened the purse and counted the money once. Hales counted separately. Their totals matched. He entered the amount in the ledger and prepared the duplicate receipts. Ruth read every line before signing her name. Then she handed Kemp his copy. Your account is current to Lady Day. Kemp stared at the words as if they carried more value than the coins he had just surrendered. My wife may put that over the mantel. Ruth smiled. Tell her paper fares badly near soot. He laughed, and the sound broke the tension. A second tenant approached, then a third. Mr. Sayer paid the corrected amount after the verified improper charges had been removed. Another farmer paid only part, and the remainder stayed honestly recorded. No one was shamed for what he could not pay. No one was forgiven what he still owed merely because the estate had failed him elsewhere. The work proceeded by figures, witnesses, signatures, and receipts. Yet what Ruth felt had little to do with administration. Men were choosing the table. They placed coins and papers before her because they trusted what would happen after their hands opened. The line extended beyond the shed and curved toward the cattle rail. Marcus remained several yards to one side, speaking only when his authority was required. Once, a tenant glanced toward him after Ruth corrected a figure. Marcus simply said, Miss Quenby has the reviewed account. The man turned back to Ruth. Nothing more was needed. By early afternoon, the final named tenancy had been entered. Hales closed the receipt book. The collected funds were transferred under ordinary estate procedure, and Ruth returned the temporary Lady Day warrant for filing. The solicitor recorded the transfer of the red-stamped sack back into his custody before his clerk carried it toward the main house. Ruth watched it leave. The evidence had done its work. It did not need to become a relic. Later, when the yard had emptied and the Dowager Duchess had returned to the house, Ruth walked toward the walled orchard behind Home Farm. The bare branches carried the first small signs of spring. She heard Marcus on the gravel path behind her and waited until he came alongside. He did not take her arm. He simply matched her pace. You have received a remarkable amount of money today, he said, for several hours. And now, Mr. Hales has it. My reign was brief. A tragedy for the duchy. Ruth glanced at him. You appear to have survived. Barely. His smile faded as they reached the orchard wall. Silence settled between them. It was no longer the silence of distrust. It was a space neither of them needed to fill too quickly. Marcus stopped. There is something I have wanted to say. Ruth's heartbeat changed. Then say it. He looked at her directly. I will not turn today into a reward for me. I behaved badly in January. I corrected it because it was wrong, not because correction should purchase anything from you. Ruth said nothing. Marcus continued. I love you, Ruth. The words were quiet enough. that she heard the honesty before the declaration. I loved your mind before I understood that admiration had become something more. I loved your courage before I deserved your trust. And when I failed you, I learned that wanting to protect you meant nothing if I was still willing to decide for you when I became afraid. Ruth felt the old hurt answer inside her, but it no longer stood alone. Beside it were December, January, the apology, the rebuilt authority, the question he had asked, instead of the order he might once have given, and the way he had stood aside while tenants chose her. Marcus took a breath. I do not want gratitude. I do not want obedience. I do not want you to stay because my title makes staying easier than leaving. I want the right to court you properly, if you want that too. Ruth looked at him for one long moment. You have become very cautious, Your Grace. Fear has finally found a useful employment. A laugh escaped her, soft and unsteady. Marcus. His face changed at the sound of his name. Ruth stepped closer. I love you, Marcus. He did not move toward her. That restraint made the answer easier to give completely. I tried not to. It would have been simpler to admire you only when you were right and dismiss you when you were wrong. But you learned. More importantly, you let me see you learn. He exhaled slowly. Is that a yes to being courted, only courted? Do not become ambitious so soon. His smile returned. I have had an exhausting day. Then rest. He looked at her mouth, then back into her eyes. May I kiss you? Ruth could have answered aloud. Instead, she made the choice visible. She closed the remaining distance herself. Marcus lifted one hand toward her face and paused until Ruth leaned into his palm. Then he kissed her. The kiss was slow, warm and careful, without hurry and without claim. Ruth placed one hand against his coat and kissed him back. For a few quiet seconds, the months between Michaelmas and Lady Day seemed to narrow into something simple enough to hold. When Marcus drew away, his forehead rested briefly against hers. I have wanted to do that for an unreasonable length of time. Ruth smiled. Then it is fortunate you finally learned patience. Will I always be examined? Almost certainly. Then I shall continue studying. She laughed, and this time he laughed with her. Beyond the orchard wall, Home Farm stood quiet after Lady Day. Goulding's keys were gone from his hands. The books were corrected where evidence allowed. The tenants had made their trust visible without being ordered to do so. And Ruth, who had spent years being useful in rooms where usefulness was expected to remain invisible, had chosen something for herself without surrendering anything she had earned. On Monday, September 29th, 1873, Ruth stood at the autumn seed table at Home Farm while a clerk explained two competing quotations to Mr. Kemp and waited for the farmer to choose between them. No one at Larkmead was supposed to decide for him any more. One merchant offered a slightly lower price with dearer carriage. The other offered a better grade at a higher initial figure but shorter delivery time. Each charge had been entered separately. No preferred factor hovered behind the numbers. Kemp rubbed one thumb along the edge of his account sheet, frowned, and pointed to the second quotation. That one. I'd rather know what's in the sack before I pay for the privilege of guessing. Ruth smiled. A dangerous habit. You started it, Your Grace. The title still caught her occasionally, not because she disliked it, but because Ruth Quenby had answered to her own name for 33 years before becoming Duchess of Rivenhall. She had married Marcus quietly 3 weeks earlier after 6 months of courtship conducted, with far more patience than either of them had expected from a duke. He had written when estate business took him away for several days. He had asked before arranging visits. He had learned that a disagreement did not become rebellion, merely because Ruth remained unconvinced. Ruth had learned something equally difficult. Accepting care was not the same as surrendering judgment. The marriage settlement protected her separate financial interests. It did not pretend to grant her authority over land that legally belonged to Marcus. That question had been handled separately. Before the wedding, Marcus had signed a formal home farm appointment, confirming Ruth's continuing managerial role with clearly defined responsibilities, and the same requirement for written accounting she expected from everyone else. She had read every line twice. Marcus had complained that matrimony was beginning to resemble an audit. Ruth had told him this was because he had chosen his bride poorly. Kemp folded the chosen quotation into his account book. "The western field held better after the August rain," he said. "Not perfectly. Nothing useful is improved by pretending it is perfect. I was hoping marriage might make you kinder. It has made me busier." His Grace said the same. Kemp touched his cap and went toward the clerk to sign the order. Ruth watched the transaction continue without her. That pleased her more than being needed. A year earlier, almost every purchasing question at Larkmead had ended with one name. Now, the system did not require Ruth Quenby to stand in every room and protect it from itself. Purchasing records were separate from rent collection. Tenants received duplicate receipts. Feed grade, carriage, and terms were entered plainly. Farmers could join pooled orders or buy independently. Mr. Hales reviewed the records without controlling the choices. The changes had not made Home Farm wealthy beyond reason. They had made it understandable. That was better. Isaac Goulding remained gone from Larkmead. The civil recovery had moved slowly, as Ruth had expected. Some money had already been returned through the Winchester commercial factor after the disputed accounts were reviewed. Other sums remained contested through the solicitor. Marcus no longer spoke of the proceedings as though rank could make them hurry. Lady Mildred Stoner had not returned to Larkmead after spring. She had sent the Dowager Duchess one correct formal letter during the summer, and spent much of the season with relations in Sussex. Ruth did not mistake her refusal to lie for friendship. Neither did she erase it, because friendship had not followed. People were allowed to possess one honorable boundary without becoming entirely different people. You are frowning at a perfectly respectable seed table. Marcus's voice came from behind her. Ruth turned. He had crossed the yard without ceremony, his hat in one hand, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a husband who believed he had caught his wife thinking too seriously. "I was considering whether the new system can survive without me, and, so far, distressingly well. I am sorry. Shall I instruct Hales to introduce several errors before luncheon?" That would be considerate. Marcus came to stand beside her. He glanced toward Kemp, who was still speaking with the clerk. He chose for himself, yes, without consulting a duke. The estate may never recover. I have been reduced to ornamental value. Ruth looked him over. Not entirely ornamental. High praise. They walked toward the prepared trial strip beyond the cattle yard. The late September ground was dark where it had been turned with narrow markers set for two different seed rates that Pritchard's compared before committing a larger field. The following year, Ruth carried a small sack under one arm. In the pocket of her working coat rested the worn beechwood seed scoop that had belonged to her maternal uncle. She had carried it before Home Farm became hers to manage, before anyone at Larkmead knew she had an opinion about cattle. Before Marcus had laughed and handed her responsibility as though it were an entertainment, the shallow old nick still marked one edge. Ruth had never repaired it. Her uncle had always said a useful tool did not need to pretend it had never been used. At the first marker, she opened the seed sack and drew out the scoop. Marcus reached toward it automatically. His hand stopped before touching the wood. Ruth noticed. He did not make a display of waiting. He simply waited. That small pause moved her more than a speech would have done. A year earlier, Marcus's instinct had been to decide, because decision was what powerful men were trained to do. Now he knew that loving Ruth did not give him ownership of every next step. She held the scoop out. "You may take it." His gaze moved from the beechwood to her face. "Certain? Don't make me regret rewarding good behavior. I have spent 6 months working toward this promotion." He took the scoop. Ruth poured seed into it and pointed toward the first marked row. "Not too thickly." "You say that as though I have no agricultural instincts. Your first instinct at Home Farm was to insult the manager. An early error, a memorable one." Marcus cast the first measure. Half the seed landed in a dense patch. Ruth stared at the ground. Marcus looked offended. The soil moved. "Of course. A treacherous field. Give me your hand." He held it out. Ruth caught his wrist lightly and adjusted the angle. Wider movement, less enthusiasm. "You married me knowing I had too much enthusiasm. I married you after making certain it had supervision." His laugh carried across the field. The next cast fell evenly. They worked down the first trial row together, trading the scoop back and forth, until Ruth stopped correcting him quite so often. Pritchard and 2 farm men remained farther downfield, near enough for propriety and far enough for privacy. At the final marker, Marcus brushed a few seeds from his glove. Was that adequate? Barely. "I shall demand a written assessment." Ruth took the scoop from him and slipped it back into her coat pocket. He watched the motion. "You never stopped carrying that." No. Even in January, she knew what he meant. Even after he had taken the purchasing warrant from her. Even when Home Farm felt briefly like a place she had been invited to occupy, but not fully trusted to understand. "No," she said. Marcus looked toward the field rather than at her. "I am still sorry." Ruth's heart tightened, not from old pain alone, but from the fact that he had learned not to apologize only when he wanted something afterward. "I know. I do not want the memory polished into a lesson that flatters me." "Good." He glanced at her. "You are severe for a new wife. You knew that before the bans. I hoped marriage might weaken your standards. Then you have again mistaken hope for evidence." His smile came slowly. Ruth reached for his hand before he could offer it. Their fingers joined with an ease that had taken months to earn. There was no trembling uncertainty in the gesture now, only choice repeated enough times to become trust. "I love you," she said. Marcus's expression softened at once. "I love you too." He lifted their joined hands slightly, then leaned toward her slowly enough that the question remained visible even after marriage. Ruth met him halfway. The kiss was brief, warm, and familiar without being careless. When they drew apart, Marcus looked over the newly sown trial row and then toward Home Farm, where clerks, tenants, cattle, and ledgers continued without requiring either of them to perform importance. "Still playing?" he asked softly. Ruth followed his gaze across the yard, where 1 year earlier people had laughed because a paid companion knew the difference between expensive feed and good farming. Then she looked at Marcus. "I never was."